Hello everybody, welcome back to a new video. My name is Sarah and today I'm going to be talking about the 7 books that I read in the month of March. So as you can see, I'm quite a tomato today. I got some really bad sunburn on my cheeks. I'm going barefaced. No makeup except for some mascara because I realized I ran out of foundation and didn't pick any up. Anyway, that's beside the point, but it's kind of why I'm going barefaced tomato right now. But anyway, yeah, so we're going to talk about the 7 books that I read in March this month. And this is actually the best reading month that I've had so far. I think January I read like 6 books, and February I read 5. So 7 is really impressive for me. Yeah, I was really excited that it was a pretty productive month. I got some arcs read and reviewed. And I will have full reviews linked down below if I have them already posted. If not, I do encourage you to keep an eye out for my blog post. I post every Friday. So without further ado, we're just going to get into the books that I read this month. So the first book that I read was Hummingbird Salamander by Jeff Vandermeer. Now this was an arc, so huge thank you to the publisher and to NetGalley for granting me access to this arc. It comes out April 6th, so if you're watching this the day this video goes live, it comes out today. I highly encourage you to pick this book up actually if you like weird science fiction or if you like science fiction thrillers. So Jeff Vandermeer is known kind of for his environmentally based science fiction novels, and this one is no different. So Hummingbird Salamander follows our main character Jane as she gets a letter from a world-renowned eco-terrorist leading her to a storage unit that holds a taxidermied hummingbird, and then various clues leading her to a taxidermied salamander. And when she takes that hummingbird out of the storage unit, she kind of just starts a domino effect of events that are way bigger than what she is. One of the biggest things to keep in mind when going into a Jeff Vandermeer novel is that you are probably going to be confused for the majority of this novel. Don't fight the confusion. My biggest piece of advice is to just kind of go with it because you will be rewarded in the end. It will all make sense in the end. I've only read the Southern Reach trilogy by him before this book. So the Southern Reach trilogy starts with the book Annihilation, but going based off of that trilogy and this book, and from what I understand of hearing from other people that have read his books, he writes his stories where the story is so much bigger than the main character and their small part in the story. So you're going to be confused. You are going to be rewarded in the end with information. However, you don't get all of the information because the event and the whole story is so much bigger than your main character. It makes sense that they're not going to end up knowing absolutely everything about what exactly is going on, if that makes sense. However, I think I found that really satisfying in this book because it makes sense. Like, Jane, you're following Jane, and the story is written in a way that it's like she's writing a letter to you as the reader in hopes that you find this letter after all of these events have happened. And so you kind of find out that she's more of a pawn and a very, very small piece in this much larger scale kind of underground multi-million-dollar company conspiracy series of events. I don't want to spoil what this book is about, but it was really interesting. I really, really enjoyed it. I think Vandermeer does a really good job of writing a sense of dread that even the reader feels. He just has this way of writing these short, choppy, sometimes fragmented sentences that between that and the language that he chooses, it really creates a sense of anxiety and dread in the reader the entire time that you're reading it. And I feel like he's really turned that into an art form because I can read a book and know that there's high stakes going on. For him to set that ground of high stakes and also have it transfer into the emotion of the reader, I think he did a really good job with that. I also think he does a really good job of making these science fiction feel very otherworldly, which also adds to the sense of dread. And he does this not necessarily with just the ideas alone, but a lot of times with the word choice and the phrase and descriptors that he chooses. They're very odd. And it just kind of makes the weirdness of the story, like, it takes it to a whole nother level. So I really enjoyed it. I did really enjoy how this story focuses a lot on environmental impact of humans, on the idea of security and surveillance too. I was not expecting that, and I actually, that was another thing that added to a sense of dread. So that was really interesting. I really enjoyed this book, and I do highly recommend it. Like I said, it comes out April 6th, so definitely consider picking this one up. I gave it 4 stars. So the second book that I picked up is a YA fantasy, and that is A Month of Beasts and Briars by Ashley Poston. So this book follows our main character, Ceres. So she lives in a kingdom that is safe from any drought or natural disasters thanks to a long ago pact or agreement made by a king with the Lady of the Wilds, who is said to live in this forest that surrounds the kingdom. And this forest, in return of having the kingdom be protected, it has become almost feral, if that makes sense. It's become wild and dangerous and corrupt. There's these monsters and creatures that have festered inside the forest, and so it's known to attack people if they go into the forest or to the edge of the forest. So it's a sentient magical wood. And Ceres, when she was a child, she had survived an attack from this wood, and because of it had been given these magical powers where her blood allowed for flowers and plants to grow. So when this story starts, a new queen is being crowned, but upon crowning of the new queen, the forest then wages an attack on the kingdom. And Ceres ends up being the only one able to go into the forest and look for the Lady of the Wilds and try to figure out what's going on, why the forest is attacking, and what she can do to stop it. Overall, this story was enjoyable, but I found it to be, one, very average and kind of like very surface level story, and 2, it read very young. Now, this is marketed as a young adult fantasy, however, to me it read much more like a middle grade. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, and I know that there are plenty of fantastic middle grade novels. However, I am not particularly interested in that age demographic of books. They just don't interest me. So it was kind of off-putting a little bit because it read so much younger. So much of this story just felt like it was geared towards a younger audience, minus the description of the like nefarious parts of the forest, like the monsters and the forest itself. That read like it was meant for an older audience because it was particularly creepy and unsettling. However, the characters themselves felt very young. They were supposed to be around 17, and they just felt much more closer to like 13, 14. And the writing style was very young. And so, like I said, nothing wrong with that, but I would keep that in mind going into this book if that's not your cup of tea. It didn't really evoke a lot of emotion in me. I didn't feel like there was much gravity to the situation, despite like knowing that there was supposed to be. It just didn't really hit me like that. And the story, like, I knew everything was gonna be fine. Like, I just really wasn't super invested in it. It was interesting. It was mostly predictable, but like in a fairy tale way where it's kind of like comforting to have it predictable. This story did have some really strong Studio Ghibli vibes, which was kind of fun to read, and I was surprised about. It felt like a cross between Kiki's Delivery Service and Princess Mononoke. So if you like both of those movies, and which I do, but you go into this knowing that it reads a lot younger and it doesn't quite have an emotional depth to it, I do think it is an enjoyable story. It wasn't necessarily that any of those points that I mentioned are bad. I actually, like I said, I think that overall it was a decent story. It was enjoyable. I was entertained. Everything just felt incredibly average, if that makes sense. So yes, I gave this 3 stars. So the third book that I read was another arc, and this is Mirrorland by Carol Johnstone. This comes out April 20th. So again, thank you to the publishers and to NetGalley for access to this arc. So Mirrorland is a psychological thriller. It follows 2 twin sisters, Kat and Elle, and when they're in their 20s. So Kat lives over stateside, and Elle lives in their childhood home with her husband in Scotland. And one day Elle goes missing, and so Kat flies back to Scotland to her childhood home. While she's there, she starts finding these notes left by her sister that kind of lead her through the house back to this place underneath the staircase called Mirrorland. It was like a childhood imaginary place for the 2 of them where they would make up a bunch of stories about pirates and witches and such. And while she's looking for information for where her sister is and also getting these notes, Kat starts remembering things from her childhood and how what she thinks her childhood was may not be what it actually was, and how that kind of ties into Elle's disappearance. If you like meticulously planned out thrillers, I think you will like this book. There is a lot put in the beginning of the book. The beginning feels rather slow, and like that there's a lot of stuff being set up, but it's kind of hard to quite piece together what exactly is being set up, because there's a lot of childhood flashbacks, and a lot of them I felt were kind of repetitive almost. I was starting to wonder, like, is this really necessary? When there was like a lot of like the repetitive flashbacks, I was like, oh, well, maybe this is just like a way to bolster a sense of background and a sense of the childhood imagination and all of these childhood stories that Kat and Elle grew up playing as. And yes, that is the case. However, each detail is very, very important to what the ending of the story is. And I did really appreciate how there wasn't a single like fluff detail. It was all very, very relevant, while also creating a really rich background. This book really blurs the line between past and present, and also between childhood fantasy and reality, and there's just a lot of like blurring back and forth between that. The one part that I didn't like about this was that the flashbacks, like back and forth between past and present, did become quite hard to like discern which was which. I did get kind of confused at some points, and I had to like backtrack and figure out where we were flipping back to present day. It didn't bother me as much when we were flipping between reality and fantasy, because that blur felt very necessary, whereas the blur between past and present felt more like it was just poorly defined, if that makes sense. What I did also really like is the further along you go in the story, the faster you flip between past, present, fiction, and reality, but the faster you flip back and forth, the more things become clear. Like, the more chaotic it gets, it also, the more understanding you have as a reader as to what's going on. I just found that really interesting. I also found it really interesting that, like, virtually none of the characters were likable. Like, they all had very pronounced negative traits. However, that, like, didn't impact the enjoyability of the story at all. It just kind of made you really want to understand how messed up this situation was even more. There are several twists in the end, several big reveals. My biggest complaint of this book was the final reveal, which was kind of like two plot twists in one, if that makes sense. It was kind of like a hybrid of two twists. I almost wish that was not there, because I really was satisfied with how the story was wrapping up with just the twist right before those final ones. It was a really well written one, and it was really satisfying, and I just feel like those extra, like, two morphed together at the end, it was almost too much for the story. There was so much going on, and it's such a messed up situation that, like, it's believable at the same time up until that very end, where it was like that adding that extra part was just like the tipping point to where it wasn't believable anymore. However, this last little bit was very necessary in order to wrap up one of the side characters' stories, and so I see why the author chose to include this in there. I just kind of wish it wasn't there, and maybe that side character story could have been wrapped up in a slightly different way. Yes, if you like psychological thrillers that kind of revolve around obsession and manipulation and like strange family dynamic, I definitely think you would enjoy this book. So like I said, it comes out April 20th, and I did give it 4 stars. So the fourth book that I read is a adult fantasy romance that is very, very popular right now, and that is From Blood and Ash by Jennifer L. Armentrout. Now, like I said, this is a super, super popular fantasy romance right now. The third book is actually coming out this month. So this is the first book in the Blood and Ash trilogy. And I was really sad to say that it did not live up to the hype for me. Overall, I was entertained. However, there were several aspects that fell short for me, and I really struggled with. From Blood and Ash, like I said, it's the first book in the Blood and Ash trilogy, and it follows our main character, Poppy, and in this world that she lives in, she's known as the Maiden. So in this world, the second sons and daughters of this kingdom, when they turn 19, they ascend, and they have their ascension day, and this is a ritual with their gods. Poppy is a special case, and she's determined to be the Maiden, where her ascension day is different than everybody else's. She doesn't know what it is. She, as the Maiden, is not to be interacted with at all. She's to live in isolation, and she's not to have any sort of like relationships or any sort of joy or pleasure or anything like that. And she has a couple of personal guards, and one of them in particular catches her eye and kind of makes her start to question whether or not she is willing to continue serving as the Maiden. There is also a kind of a paranormal fantasy element to this. I'm not gonna really go into that because then that starts spoiling things about this book. First of all, I want to say right out that I'm not a fan of Armentrout's writing style. For 2 reasons. First reason, I just kind of think that the writing feels very bland to me. There's no sense of real like author voice or anything. Secondly, Armentrout uses an obscene amount of ellipses in this book, and it really bothered me. I kind of had like a warning going into that was the case, so I was like, oh, knowing this, it's not going to bother me as much, but it did. They were used to the point where it was just distracting, and I found it to be a tad obnoxious. So I did really like how Poppy was written as a character, and I also liked how some of her relationships were in, particularly her relationship with the one companion that she is allowed, Tawny, and then one of her other guards, Victor, who is kind of like a father figure to her. I think that the dialogue and the banter amongst the 3 of them was really enjoyable to read, and I really did like those interactions, and I really enjoyed how loyal and feisty and strong-willed and stubborn Poppy was. World building wise, I feel like a lot of the world building happened too late in the book. Like, it felt like what should have happened more towards the beginning of the book happened more in the middle of the story, and it just was really frustrating trying to get a sense of this world and trying to really like sink myself into it and get invested in the story. I felt like it took me a little longer than usual because of this delayed world building. It's an interesting concept. I liked how it was very much centered around the paranormal aspects of the story as well as the religious aspects of the story. I also found the Ascension to be really unique and interesting. However, like how I wanted more world building in the beginning, I did also just want more world building in general. I do have a feeling that we're going to get a lot more in the second book, which is good because I want to know more. I want more depth, and I want a stronger sense of structure to this world and understanding of it. Plot-wise, it's not like a super complicated plot or anything. It was entertaining, and I am interested to see where this book goes because it left off in a way that I wasn't quite expecting, because the entire time leading up to the very last page we were completely headed in one direction, and then on the last page we did a entire 180, and I was just like, where did this come from? So I'm looking forward to seeing an explanation of why we're going in this direction, and then seeing how this direction pans out in the second book. I think overall, the best way to describe this is that this is very much a guilty pleasure read. It's entertaining enough, but it's nothing like spectacular in my opinion. So I will be continuing this series. I'm curious to see how it pans out, and I have heard that the second book is a lot better than this first one, so I'm hoping that that's the case. But I did give From Blood and Ash 3 stars. So the fifth book that I read was actually an audiobook, and that was If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. So this is a kind of a dark academia mystery novel. So we're following our main character Oliver, who's been in prison for 10 years for his involvement in a murder back when he was in his last year of college. And he's just now getting out of prison when we start the book, and he is for the first time telling the entire story of what actually happened behind this murder, and how everything unraveled between him and his 6 friends that all were in the same Shakespearean theater program back in their last year of college. I really enjoyed this book. I think, so listening to the audiobook, it has its pros and cons because I really loved the narrator of this book. I think that he did a phenomenal job, and there was actually a point in this book where I was listening, and I feel like if I was just reading the book physically, I would not have gotten nearly as emotional, and I would not have started tearing up like I did if it wasn't for the fact that I had the narrator evoking so much emotion through his voice and through his narration in this one particular scene. He did such a phenomenal job. However, on the flip side, there are several scenes where we are reading about our characters going through rehearsal, and they are actually giving their lines, and you are reading their lines, like their Shakespeare lines. And so if you're not a theater buff or a Shakespeare buff, and you're just not super comfortable with that style of writing, it can be kind of a struggle to follow along if you're not reading the words yourself and you're just listening to somebody speak them. However, on the other side, Shakespeare is meant to be performed and not just read, so it is also, you could see it as more of a benefit to listen to the audiobook than just read it, since you are listening to someone speak the lines and perform them. If that makes sense. I kind of was on the other side though, and I struggled a little bit. I don't think that in any way bars anybody from reading this book and enjoying it, because I think that you can still really enjoy it without being a huge Shakespeare fan or super comfortable with Shakespeare's work, because I enjoyed it, and you can still understand the story and still follow along and get a lot out of it. I think it helps if you are really comfortable with those works, and you have like that background knowledge, because there are a lot of parallels between the plays into the story of If We Were Villains. I say that because I was able to pick up on some very surface level ones with the very basic knowledge that I have of Shakespeare. So I feel like there was plenty of stuff that I ended up missing, but like I said, I feel like that doesn't prevent a reader from enjoying this story, because there is so much more outside of just the plays and the rehearsals that you read about, because the story is very much centered around Oliver and his 6 friends and their relationships. It was really fascinating to listen to, because you've got these 7 characters that this is their 4th year together, so they are very, very comfortable with one another, and yet everything is so volatile between all of them, and I just found a lot of the emotion and tension was really well written, and really brought to life on within this story, and I just really enjoyed listening to it. I will say it is a slower story, but that's kind of par for the course with this type of book. And what surprised me was the murder happened like at the halfway point of this book. So then we had the entire second half, where when I got to the murder scene, I was like, what? We're only at like the 50% point. But the second half is just as enjoyable as the first. Things start to really spiral out of control a lot more in that second half, and I just really enjoyed it, and I think it was really well written. I also think Rio just has a very elegant writing style to begin with. It was just very pleasing to listen to. I did end up giving it 5 stars because I really, really loved it, and I found the ending to be incredibly satisfying, and I just, my heart broke for some of the characters, and I just think that the tension was written really, really well, and I thoroughly enjoyed listening to it. So the 6th book that I read this month in March, it was The Raven Boys by Maggie Stiefvater. So this is the first book in the Raven Cycle series. It's a little bit of an older YA series. I think this first came out in like 2012. I really loved this book. So I kind of have a hard time like describing this because I feel like there's a lot going on in this novel. So I am going to read the synopsis off of the back of this in hopes that it gives you a better overall view of everything that is kind of going on in this book, compared to what I can just summarize myself. So it says, there are only 2 reasons a non-seer would see a spirit on St. Mark's Eve. Either you're his true love or you killed him. Every year, Blue Sergeant stands next to her clairvoyant mother as the soon-to-be-dead walk past. Blue never sees them until this year when a boy emerges from the dark and speaks to her. His name is Gainsey, and he's a rich student at Algonby, the local private school. Blue has a policy of staying away from Algonby boys. Known as Raven Boys, they can only mean trouble. But Blue is drawn to Gainsey in a way she can't entirely explain. He is on a quest that has encompassed 3 other Raven Boys. Adam, the scholarship student who resents the privilege around him. Ronan, the fierce soul whose emotions range from anger to despair. And Noah, the taciturn watcher who notices many things but says very little. For as long as she can remember, Blue has been warned that she will cause her true love to die. She doesn't believe in true love and never thought this would be a problem, but as her life becomes caught up in the strange and sinister world of the Raven Boys, she's not so sure anymore. The biggest thing to know about going into this book is that the entire first maybe half to 2/3, it feels like nothing's happening. However, I still was just like, really vibing with the story. Like, I was just really enjoying it because of the atmosphere behind the story. I just really loved the folklore, academia, psychic, clairvoyant, spirit world atmosphere, if that makes sense. I also just really liked the characters a lot. The banter was really fun, and I thought that they were all really interesting and had really believable and interesting dynamics between all of them. It was just really fun to read. Once things kick off in this book, I found it to be even more fascinating, and I just really fell for this book. Like, it hooked me from the atmosphere in the beginning, and once things really started happening, I was like full force set on this story. Like, I really enjoyed it. I think that the like spirit world and fantastical supernatural elements of the story were really creative and really fascinating to read about. The best way to describe this book is that it's just a vibe. The entire book is a vibe. I really feel like, though, that this book it's like 400 pages long, and it felt like a 400-page prologue, but I was here for it. I'm really looking forward to continuing this series. You really can tell that in this book we're really only scratching the surface level of what the story and the quest of our 4 Raven boys in blue have to offer. I ended up giving it 4.5 stars, and I'm really looking forward to continuing this series. So the 7th and final book that I read in the month of March is Madam by Phoebe Wynn. This is also another arc, so this is the 3rd arc that I read this month, and it comes out May 18th. So once again, thank you to the publishers and to NetGalley for granting me access to this arc. So Madam is kind of a gothic, dark academia. I don't necessarily know if it should be classified as like a thriller or a mystery, but it's definitely gothic literature. So this book is set in the early 90s, and we follow our main character Rose, who is a very young teacher, and she gets a job at a very affluent, world-renowned, all-girls boarding school to teach in their classic civilization department. And when she gets there, she notices that things are like kind of odd. She's not told very much. The only explanation that she's ever given is that the school is a very traditional school. And it's very set in its traditions, and it loves its traditions. And that's kind of the only explanation that she's really given. And she hears a lot of weird things from the girls, and there's just weird events. And it's kind of all I can really tell you without like spoiling the story. This book is rather slow, but that's kind of par for the course with gothic literature, I feel like. So you kind of like have to go into it knowing that that's just kind of a typical quality of a gothic story. You do spend a lot of time just like building up to this like big reveal of why everything is so weird, and like we finally get answers to Rose's questions. I feel like we get the answer at like maybe between the halfway and 2/3 point. By the time we get to that answer, it is a bit predictable. Like, I feel like there were certain hints dropped that were a bit heavy-handed. That being said, I will say that the like twist was and the big reveal was still very satisfying and unsettling. There was one particular scene that I kind of got really sick to my stomach reading, and I nearly had to put the book down and walk away because it made me super uncomfortable. And I feel like that's really the point of this book. This is a very feminist-centered novel, which I really enjoyed. And I really enjoyed Rose as a character. She's very headstrong, and she's level-headed. There are fireworks. I feel like a really good role model for her students, and I really loved her relationship with 3 of her kind of like middle year students. It was just really enjoyable to read and see how those 3 characters kind of progressed as the story went along, and how like their relationship with Rose really strengthened and they really leaned on her. It was really nice to read about. The ending did surprise me a little bit. Like I knew what was gonna happen, but I was expecting it to play out in a different way. And I think that was really well done, and I did really enjoy it. I really enjoyed Wynn's writing style. It was a little more on the flowery side, but I like that in particular. It wasn't overly flowery, but it does lean towards that style of writing a little bit more, and I just found it really enjoyable to read. I think it helped set the gothic atmosphere a lot more because of how descriptive her writing is. But despite the incredibly slow first half of this book, I did really enjoy it, and I do think that it is a really strong feminist novel. I know it said if you like The Handmaid's Tale and that style of story, that you will probably like this one. I actually have not read The Handmaid's Tale, but what I do know of the story, I can see where Madam would be compared to this book. Overall, I did give this book 4 stars, and like I said, if you're interested, it does come out May 18th, so keep your eye out for that. So my stack of books is pretty small this month. It's only 3. However, that doesn't include the 3 arcs that I read and then the 1 audiobook that I read. So 3 physical plus the 4 that I don't have in my hands, totaling to 7. I would love to hear in the comments if you've read any of these books and what your thoughts are on them, if you agree or disagree with any points that I made, or if you're just interested in reading any of them, and I'd love to hear which ones you are looking forward to. Thanks so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you consider sticking around and subscribing. But otherwise, I hope that you have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye!